This is the 45th episode of the series Decolonizing the Mind. This episode deals with decolonizing the Jewish Holocaust. We are in a pivotal period in world history now in which Palestine, occupation of Palestine, plays an important role. And the Jewish Holocaust, anti Semitism, and everything that is around it is very important to understand what's going on in Palestine if you understand the background of the Jewish state. Now, um, you must understand that the history of the Jewish people is a history of suffering, in particular by Christians. Christians held Jews accountable for the death of Jesus. John the Apostle equated Jews with the devil. Christians blamed the Black Death pandemic that swept throughout Asia and the Middle East into Europe between 1347 and 1350 on Jews. The Catholic Church accused Jews of being child murderers, draining Christian children of their blood in order to use it to bake matzos for the Jewish holiday of Passover. The Protestant leader of the Reformation, Martin Luther, who lived in the 16th century, wrote a treatise titled On the Jews and Their Lies, in which he described Jews as whoring people, that is, no people of God, and their boast of lineage, circumcision, and law must be accounted as filth. He advised to burn down synagogues, refuse to let Jews buy houses among Christians, confiscate Jewish writing, and prohibit rabbis from preaching. That is the Protestant Christian tradition of the Reformation. Erasmus, who is heralded as the humanist philosophers, called Jews the most pernicious plague and bitterest foe of the teaching of Jesus Christ. So Erasmus was a ferocious anti-Semite, but praised as a humanist philosophers. The university which I studied in Rotterdam, Holland, is called the Erasmus University. And then you have the Enlightenment. The philosophers of the Enlightenment, who were racist to the core, were also anti-Semitic. The philosophers were critical of Christianity, and some were sympathetic to the plight of the Jewish people, but the leading thinkers were imbued with anti-Semitism. Denis Diderot, 18th century thinker, philosopher of the French Enlightenment, wrote about Jews. There is to be found among them only a confused mixture of the principles of reason and of revelation, an affected and often impenetrable obscurity, principles that lead to fanaticism, a blind respect for the authority of the doctors and of antiquity. In a word, all of the defects indicative of an ignorant and superstitious nation, talking about Jews. Voltaire, an important philosopher of the Enlightenment, wrote about Jews. They are all of them born with raging fanaticism in their heart, just as the Bretons and the Germans are born with blonde hair. I would not be in the least bit surprised if these people would not someday become deadly to the human race. And he addresses the Jews directly and saying, You seem to be the maddest of the lot. The Kafirs, the Hottentots, the Negroes of Guinea are much more reasonable and more honest people than your ancestors, the Jews. You have surpassed all nations in impertinent fables, in bad conduct, and in barbarism. You deserve to be punished, for this is your destiny. Yes, Voltaire, heralded as a great thinker of the French Enlightenment. Now, anti Semitism was embedded in European civilization. It was not an aberration of European history, it was part of it. Hitler placed his hatred for Jews in the context of his Christian belief. Hitler was a Christian, and in a speech in 1922 he says, My feeling as a Christian points me to my Lord and Savior as a fighter. In boundless love as a Christian and as a man, I read through the passage which tells us how the Lord at last rose in his might and seized the scourge to drive out of the temple the brood of 5% of adders. How terrific was his fight for the world against the Jewish poison. When Hitler took over in 1933, he says that his national government regards Christianity as the founder of our national morality. Now, when you talk about terrorism, fascism, they conveniently leave out of the narrative that Hitler himself considered himself to be a Christian. So the whole Christian aspect is let out of the narrative that tells you how they have been rewriting history, leaving out this important fact. And then the Jews suffered from pogroms, and the first pogroms, persecution of the Jews, was in 1096 when the first crusade started with Christian military campaign, a campaign to conquer Jerusalem, Al-Quds, which was under Muslim rule, and it began with the massacres of Jews in Europe. Like Muslims, Jews were regarded as non-believers, and thousands of Christians from France traveled via Germany to Jerusalem, Al-Quds. In the German district of Rhineland, they carried out the Rhineland massacres, in which thousands of Jews were murdered. It was the first pogrom in Europe, and many pogroms followed, culminating in the Holocaust perpetrated by the Nazis. So the systematic destruction of Jewish life during the Holocaust was beyond human imagination. Now, my point in decolonizing Jewish Holocaust is this. The story of the Holocaust is part of the public memory of man's inhumanity to man. But compared to the genocide of colonialism, the Holocaust is a local phenomenon, not a global one. More particular, the Holocaust is a European problem, and anti-Semitism that comes with it is part of the Western civilization. It's not a problem of the Chinese, Hindu, African or Muslim civilization. The overwhelming majority of the world suffered racism by Western colonialism. And racism is a worldwide problem. Anti-Semitism is a problem of the European civilization, and more specifically of Christianity. Hitler's legacy and anti-Semitism were mostly a problem for Europe, while colonialism and racism were a problem for the whole world. There are a few misconceptions about the Jewish Holocaust. One is that it is the worst crime against humanity. It was not. That it was the Holocaust was the main concern for Hitler. That Hitler and Nazism was about the Holocaust. It is not. And that fascism is the worst political ideology. It is not. I'll explain these things in the course of this podcast. Now, let's compare how people of color, colonized people, looked at the Holocaust. And Frantz Fanon said, when I turn on my radio, when I hear that Negroes have been lynched in America, I say that we have been lied to. Hitler is not dead. When I turn on my radio, when I learn that Jews have been insulted, mistreated, persecuted, I say that we've been lied to. Hitler is not dead. When finally I turn on my radio and hear that in Africa forced labor has been inaugurated and legalized, I say that we certainly have been lied to. Hitler is not dead. M.C. Serre says, every European has a Hitler inside him, that Hitler inhabits him, that Hitler is his demon, and if he rails against him, he is being inconsistent, and that, at bottom, what he can't forgive Hitler for is not crime in itself, the crime against man. It is not the humiliation of man as such, is the crime against the white man, the humiliation of the white man, and the fact that he applied to European colonial procedure which until then had been reserved exclusively for the Arabs of Algeria, the coolies of India, and the blacks of Africa. So M.C. Serre is saying what Hitler has been doing, you guys have been doing in the colonies all the time. Winston Churchill says Hitler is a monster of wickedness, insatiable in his lust for blood and plunder. That is sorry, the view of Churchill, but while Churchill contrasted Hitler with the British and the rest of the civilized world, Hitler himself saw the British and the rest of the civilized world as his model and inspiration for Nazism and the Third Reich, the Third Empire. The First Empire was founded by German Charles the Great in the 8th century, who united most of Western Europe into the European Middle Ages. The Second Empire was led by Otto von Bismarck in the 19th century, who created a unified German state as a federation of formerly loosely states with a national parliament and universal suffrage for men. The new empire that should have lasted for 1,000 years was to be built by the Nazis with the British as their model. So, how did Hitler look at Britain as his model, British colonialism? He says, what India was for England, the territories of Russia will be for us. It should be possible for us to control this region to the east with 250,000 men plus a cadre of good administrators. Let's learn from the English, says Hitler, who, with 250,000 men in all, including 50,000 soldiers, governed 400 million Indians. The space in Russia must always be dominated by Germans. The Russian space is our India. Like the English, we shall rule this empire with a handful of men. The wealth of Great Britain is the result of a perfect commercial organization than of the capitalist exploitation of the 350 million Indian slaves. So Hitler's saying, what we want to do is what you're doing in India, Churchill. And as you exploited them and you oppressed them, that is what we are going to do with Eastern Europe, with Russia. He says, looking at the example of the British in India, he said the German colonists in Russia ought to live on handsome, spacious farms like the British do in India. The German services will be lodged in marvelous buildings, the governors in palaces. Beneath the shelter of the administrative services, we shall gradually organize all that is indispensable to the maintenance of a certain standard of living. Around the city, to the depth of 30 to 40 kilometers, we shall have a belt of handsome villages connected by the best roads. Like now in Palestine, how the Jewish settlements are organized like this. What exists beyond that will be another world in which we mean to let the Russians live as they like. It's merely necessary that we should rule them. In the event of a revolution, we shall only have to drop a few bombs on the city and the affair will be liquidated. That is what the British were doing in India and what the Zionists are doing now in Gaza and the West Bank. Hitler says we ought to remember that during the first period of American colonization, numerous Aryans earned their daily livelihood as trappers and hunters, etc., frequently wandering about in large groups with their women and children. Their mode of existence very much resembling that of ordinary nomads. The moment, however, that they grew more numerous and were able to accumulate larger resources, they cleared the land and drove out the aborigines. At the same time establishing settlements which rapidly increased all over the countries. This is the model which he refers to, obviously, of Northern Abiyala, North America, where the whites came and drove out the indigenous population, what the Jews are doing in Palestine, driving out the Palestinians from the land, and that is a model of Hitler. He says, had it not been possible for them to employ members of the inferior race which they conquered, the Aryans would never have been in a position to take the first steps on the road which led them to a later type of culture. Just as without the help of certain suitable animals which they were able to tame, they would never have come to the invention of mechanical power that has subsequently enabled them to do without these beasts. So he's saying this technological progress, based upon exploitation of land and labor. And he continues, when one contemplates this primitive world, one is convinced that nothing will drag it out of its indolence unless one compels the people to work. The Slavs are a mass of born slaves who feel the need for a master. So he says, you should rule, you should rule like masters are ruling the slaves. Muhammad Ali, when visiting the site of the World Trade Center after September 11, was asked by a journalist, how do you feel about the fact that the terrorists responsible for the attack shared your Muslim faith? And Ali says, how do you feel about Hitler sharing your Christian faith? This is decolonizing the mind. Hitler and Christianity. Hitler says Catholics and Protestants are fighting with one another to their heart's content, while the enemy of Aryan humanity and all Christendom is laughing up to his slaves. The Jew is of this world only, and his mentality is as foreign to the true spirit of Christianity as his character was foreign to the great founder of this new creed 2000 years ago. And the founder of Christianity made no secret indeed of his estimation of the Jewish people. When he found it necessary, he drove those enemies of the human race out of the temple of God, because then, as always, they use religion as a means of advancing their commercial interests. But at the time, Christ was nailed to the cross for his attitudes towards the Jews. Now, what are the conclusions? Conceptually and practically, there's no difference between Nazism and colonialism. In fact, colonialism was worse than Nazism and fascism. So let's look at the victims of World War II. In the West, it seems as if World War II was about Hitler invading France, wanting to threaten Britain. It's hardly mentioned that 25 million of the about 40 million victims of World War II were in Russia. You see, and China had 10 million occupied by Japanese fascists. So we are talking about maybe 50 million victims of the World War II, and the majority of them was in Russia. And if you look at the Holocaust was not about Western Jews, but about Jews in Eastern Europe. It was part of the ethnic cleansing of Eastern Europe in order to rule Eastern Europe like the British rule India. Half of the victims of the 6 million Jews who were killed during the Holocaust came from Poland. And so Ukraine, Poland were the biggest countries where the biggest losses were of the Jews, Holocaust. And people think that World War II was started because of the Jews. No, the decision on the Holocaust, before 1941, the Nazi policy toward the Jews was based on forcing them to emigrate from the Third Reich, not on killing them. The policy entailed the expropriation of Jewish property, the introduction of laws to ban marriages between Jews and non-Jews, and occasionally the organization of fires like in the case of the Crystal Night on November 9 to 10, 1938, when a pogrom was organized during which the windows of Jewish stores, buildings, and synagogues were destroyed. So the decision to start the Holocaust was made after Hitler's army had managed to cut off Leningrad on the northern front and capture Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, in September 1941. The war was, already in its first year, and the prospect for a final victory looked bright. The problem of what to do with the millions of Jews living in Eastern Europe, soon to be part of the Third Reich, was now on the agenda. Migration was not an option, so the idea of annihilation became a reality. And once the decision was taken, it was a matter of technicality. The technical solution that was ultimately implemented was the gas chamber. Now, How did the Holocaust become the top marker in the hierarchy of human suffering? First of all, we would say, no, there's no hierarchy in human suffering, right? So, whether it's an individual, a group, every human that is killed uh, is as bad as another human. Yet, the Holocaust introduced a hierarchy in human suffering where the Holocaust was on the top. And the way they did it in Western narratives is with the concept of singularity, saying that the Holocaust is a particular, unique episode in human history. And once you do that, once you construct a hierarchy in which the Holocaust is at the top through this concept of uniqueness, you trivialize other colonial crimes against humanity. And then you don't talk about them. It's not in the public memory. The concept of singularity, the unique distinctiveness, was introduced in the 1918s in a debate between left-wing and right-wing historians, and the concept of singularity was introduced by left-wing historian Jürgen Habermas, and right-wing historian Eric Nolte was his counterpart. And Nolte was saying, look at the crimes of Stalin, 20 million dead. So the Holocaust was not unique. Mind you, Nolte didn't talk about colonialism. He was an anti-communist, a right-winger, and so he brings on Stalin, not colonialism, not transatlantic slavery. And Habermas argues that Holocaust is unique because of the industrialization and bureaucratization of a killing machine with the aim of destroying human life of an ethnic group. The method, which is the industrialized form of the gas chambers, and the aim were unique. And therefore, this singularity, this uniqueness, elevates the Holocaust to the top of a hierarchy of suffering. He leaves out the fact that the concept of the Holocaust, the concept of annihilating a whole ethnic group, was introduced by the Germans already in Namibia at the beginning of the 20th century, 94 to 97, when they set up and set up concentration camp, not gas chamber, concentrated camp, where they conducted medical experiments, killed 100,000 Herero and 10,000 Namaki people in Namibia, and they used an order called the Destruction Order, Vernichtigingsbevel, to annihilate the whole ethnic group. That Vernichtigingsbevel literally was used in the Jewish Holocaust. But Habermas and they forget this. They leave it out. They're not forgetting, they leave it out in order to elevate the Holocaust at the top of human hierarchy of human suffering. And they erase all the similarities, they trivialize the crimes of colonialism, and they erase the crucial differences between the Holocaust and colonial crimes. Take, for example, if you compare slavery, the enslavement of African people. In the Jewish Holocaust, they put batches of yellow stars on cloth of Jews. In Africa and in the colonies, they use iron branding on bare skin. The Jews were at least acknowledged as human beings. In the colonies, the Africans were kept and registered in the bookkeeping like cattle. The Holocaust lasted for basically the Holocaust itself for 4 years, and the whole system of fascism for a few decades before when Hitler came to power. Transatlantic slavery lasted for 300 to 350 years. So the Nazis got people of the country they invaded and occupied involved in collaborating with the occupation. In this way, they created the infrastructure for the transportation of Jews to the concentration camp. The Nazis got the Jewish leader of the Jewish community in the occupied countries involved in collaborating to setting up the infrastructure for the transportation. And in the concentration camp, they ensured that Jews were involved in the work of killing other Jews. There, there have been a study, a 14-volume study of the Nazi occupation in Holland, and I went through all these volumes and listed all the way, the manners in which the Nazis forced the Dutch to cooperate with the system. Very elaborate. People, um, who took Jews in their home and then betrayed them because the Nazis gave them rewards for betrayment. The universities, the police, the education ministry, the libraries, they all cooperated in establishing an institution, Nazism, in Holland. So there was a whole infrastructure in the form of the so-called Jewish Council, where Jewish leaders formed a council and then they did the administration of all the Jews in Holland, collecting them, making sure that they go on transportation to the labor camps and to the gas chambers. In Auschwitz, there's a count uh, of one of the Jews there about the Southern Commando, which was an elite group that had advantages and privileges already noted there, and their lot was indeed better than other Jews. And here it is. Nobody would think in the study of the Holocaust to put the guilt of the collaborator to the Jews as a whole. They would see them as collaborators which were forced rather than enticed. In the transatlantic slavery, the guilt of the collaborators is shifted from the black victims not to the white colonialism. So they are saying, oh, Africans betrayed Africans, Africans enslaved Africans, Africans sold Africans. And that is colonizing the mind, where that type of argument would be seen as immoral by putting the guilt of the collaborator on the backs of the victim. Would never have been done in the Holocaust. Compare the lives that have been destroyed in the Black Holocaust, transatlantic slavery. We're talking about 200 to 400 million people, with 12 million people transported from Africa to the Americas, Abiela, 50 to 60 million people who died in Africa during that first process of kidnapping and bringing to the coast, and then generations, 200 years, 300 years of people growing up during slavery and where their life were already destroyed as they were enslaved. The indigenous Holocaust, the Holocaust of the people of Abya, 50 to 75 millions. I talked in a previous podcast about the Victorian Holocaust, 30 to 60 million people who had died in India and China and Brazil because of the way colonialism organized food transportation. In Congo, the Congolese Holocaust by the Belgians, who half of the population of 20 million people were killed by the Belgians during 30 years. The Jewish Holocaust lasted 5 years, destroyed the life of 6 million Jews, and yet it figured prominently at the top of the so-called hierarchy of human suffering. Now, I won't go into all the details of the other Holocaust, but my conclusion is this. Colonialism was the worst crime in human history compared to Nazism, but because of racism and colonizing of the mind, it has been deleted from history book. I deal with this whole issue of the decolonizing the Jewish Holocaust in my book in paragraph 8.3 on the role of Nazism and the Jewish Holocaust. You can download the PDF from the website sandohero.com. And if you want to support the DTM channel, subscribe to it, share it with friends, families, and colleagues, and encourage them to subscribe, get involved in discussion group. And if you want to make a donation, look at sandohero.com on how to do it. Thank you for your attention and see you next time.